Okay, I hope you're all seeing today's date. Um, so, uh, are we good?
Yes.
Okay, so this was my provisional outline for today, and I was going to get to Sarah. Well, you'll see as this unfolded, Gaza became a bigger and bigger story with the prosecutor making his move in the International Criminal Court yesterday. And so a little bit of change of plans. Sorry, Unipro. Um, um, Karim Khan requested arrest warrants for both Netanyahu and Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, yesterday. And also for Israel's defense minister, Gallant, and a few other folks. And also another couple of Hamas leaders. We're not familiar with him because he's a very shadowy figure in Hamas. And he has not been seen for years. But among the 70 million digital files that have been recovered by the IDF in Gaza, they found him with face recognition technology. So he is alive and well. His nickname is Dife, which means guest, because he's always on the run and never sleeps in the same place twice for good reason. He's survived 7 assassinations. I misspelled that. I put this together pretty fast. Attempts. Has been Israel's most wanted man since 1995. His wife and his infant son and a 3-year-old daughter were killed by an Israeli airstrike. What is that? Yeah, 10 years ago. So
John, is there significance that he's holding either a Hamilton or a Jackson? That's a U.S. currency in his hand.
Well, I'm sure there is, but I don't know what it is. Anybody want to wager a guess? I don't know. The other Hamas guy is Hania. Now, he used to be in charge of all of political Hamas and ran Gaza, but he was replaced by Sinwar 7 years ago. But he was still left in a position of power, but he's now the chairman of the Hamas political bureau, but he's the liaison with Iran. You know, it's funny because Hamas is Sunni, right? But he gets all of his financing by a Shiite government who's just trying to build up all possible avenues to attacking Israel and taking down Israel. He's based in Qatar now. He used to be based in Damascus, but that became a kind of chancy place to live. So these guys are indicted too. And so what is that? Two Israelis, 3 Hamas. Nevertheless, there's some concern that doing it at the same time implies some equivalence. So we'll get to that in just a second, but nevertheless, it's done, and some might see it as being even-handed. This is the first time the International Criminal Court has targeted a top leader that's an ally of us. We're not members, right? But we cozied up to it as soon as they indicted Putin. And so this puts Netanyahu in the company of Putin. Other people who have been indicted by the International Criminal Court are Gaddafi for a brief period of time before he was killed on the street. The France and Germany is supporting the independence of the prosecutor. The United States is not. In fact, Congress is calling for us to sanction the prosecutor, and some Republicans are saying sanction the whole International Criminal Court, of which we're not a member. Germany disagreed with this equivalence problem that I was talking about, where Hamas and Israel are equivalent. But that's what he decided to do, and it's a huge step. I was going to be deep into Sarah by now, but it's kind of puts a final chapter on the last three sessions where we've been talking about the international law and what it means.
So, John, this is Harold. What do we know about Khan? Has he got an agenda? How do we know that he is even-handed in this endeavor?
Okay, I've got some slides. They're coming up, Harold. Hang on. And if I don't answer your question, I put my feet back in the fire. Oh, well, we go right to the review. I wanted to review what we said about him last week. Pretty good, huh, Harold?
Shaking hands with Mr. PLO. That's really even-handed.
Well, but here's the thing. The PLO is the governing body that made the charge. And they are members of the International Criminal Court. They're members. Israel's not, but they are, and they've been recognized. And some people, and I think Jim raised the question last week, technically, they're not the governing power in Gaza, and that's true. But somehow it got finessed, and I looked around to see if I could figure out how that happened, but it did. So Khan is his family are Pakistani that immigrated to Britain. His father's a dermatologist. His mother is a nurse. And he worked his way up as a barrister in England. So he's a legitimate guy. He was, I think, first involved in the prosecutions against the Serbians, Milosevic, as a low-level prosecutor. But he's been around a long time. Now, of the 140 members of the International Criminal Court, he is in an elected position. The prosecutor is an elected position. He's just not some random guy that's stepping up. And so he's part of the establishment in The Hague, and he's got some credibility and gravitas and certainly in the British Isles, but also, as you can see, France and Germany are supporting him.
So, John, I guess what's bothering me is it seems like verdict first, trial later. I mean, aren't you supposed to gather evidence before you indict somebody and issue arrest warrants?
So it hasn't. His recommendation is he's just issued arrest warrants, but it has to be approved by a three person panel. So this is just the first step. There are checks and balances on him. And we'll see if the three person panel endorses what he's done.
So what could be the possible basis for them to endorse it or not endorse it?
Looking at the evidence that he's collected.
And what evidence has he possibly collected?
Harold, I've got this wonderful Ezra Klein interview, and I thought it was so good that I went and found the transcript. So you're anticipating where I'm going wonderfully this morning. I'm going to be getting to that transcript pretty soon. And the evidence is laid out pretty well in that Ezra Klein interview. But it's with a Turkish woman who's a professor at Yale. So she'll run through the evidence and then we can discuss it. Anything else? Shigeko.
Where did he go to law school? Where did he get his education?
In Britain, I think I'm not sure. I think it was at a good enough place for him to become a barrister, right? He's not just a lawyer. To get what's called your QC, you've got to be a high level lawyer. But he's mainstream in the British legal system. I can safely say that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So
I went to school at Oxford, Wolfson College of Oxford.
Well, there you go. Oxford. That's pretty good. He may even, he has the ability eventually to accuse the whole Russian military of the crime of aggression. And we'll see if he uses, it's considered the supreme international crime. And so far, they've only gone after Putin specifically. And another Russian lawyer who's in charge of children's welfare, they're accusing her of genocide in that children, and Russians would say they're orphans, Ukrainian war orphans have been forcibly taken to Russia and indoctrinated. And that's considered a crime under genocide. So she's been indicted as well as Putin. Okay. So America and Russia haven't joined the criminal court, but neither have China, India, and of course Israel. But the PLL joined, and that's so. This is him meeting with the plaintiff. There have been attempts to quiet him, right? And in a way, it's it's sort of trying to intimidate the legal system. So Israel has said they would punish the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, for bringing this up and making a formal complaint. And that's kind of intimidating the legal process. So Khan has come out against that. And again, as I said earlier, he's come out against congressional calls for sanctions against the ICC. So America's official position is not supportive. We're against this very much publicly. And that the court lacks jurisdiction in Gaza, which maybe they're relying on Jim Teisel's point. America has urged Israel to do more, and we're familiar with that, and even withheld weapons, and that it's suspended a shipment of heavy munitions. But that's going to come up in this Ezra Klein interview. So let's move on. This is his background. He investigated the most recent is the ISIS atrocities in Iraq. As I said, he was elected on secret ballot, English bar in 1992, regarded as a tough, fiercely clever advocate. And as I said earlier, he was more involved in the war crimes in Yugoslavia. The question that the economists ask, look, what's the point of all this? This is a question they asked last week, not knowing that there was going to be an actual indictment. But they listed 4, that even if you don't get a conviction, you get a reputational and perhaps economic cost. And we're going to see later on when we get to talking about the particular case of South Africa, that the boycott against apartheid worked. It also strengthens the negotiating hand, and you can argue since Putin's been indicted, that has strengthened the support for Ukraine, and also just the historical record. All these people who are investigating war crimes in Ukraine, knowing that probably most of them won't see the light of day, but at least you're establishing the historical record. And who knows, maybe there'll be a special tribunal to prosecute Russia, since there's so many of these, and set up shop right in Ukraine and deal with what they're doing with large indictments and prosecutions. All right, so this is the interview. I've been laboring all morning getting it on into slides. I just heard it knocked my socks off. There were so many important points made, and I hope I've got them all down and I don't miss any of them. This is the blurb. We sometimes get complacent because we hear about international law, but nothing ever happens, and bad guys get away with it. But that doesn't mean that the law doesn't exist and doesn't have force. So that this kind of invisible veil of justice, even if it's thwarted, it's still there. And of course, the problem is that it's there, and Palestinians, for one, expect action. And for them, it's a lot of false promises. And certainly there's millions of instances where international law has not helped. Syria, Yemen, or Ethiopia, Eritrea, and that quite often the UN is portrayed as being impotent. So what's the law for? Just once again, from their point of view, we'll look at Israel and Palestine, which is really a special case because the UN was in on the birth of these two entities. In the case of Palestine, their actual birth was the League of Nations. They had already enjoyed the status of people who deserved the right to speak for themselves. But Israel, that was created in 1948, as we've gone over innumerable times in recent weeks. And so right now, up until yesterday, the international law was failing in Gaza. But Ezra was prescient in saying this may be starting to change. And lo and behold, yesterday it did. So this is who he interviewed. She's a professor at Yale, Turkish background. I think you'll be impressed with her. Her specialty is international human rights law, and she teaches the third world approach to that. I noticed that Yale gets away with saying third world. I said third world in front of my residents at the hospital, and I was told, Dr. Lee, we don't use that anymore. And I said, well, what am I supposed to say? And they said, global south. Even developing world is a no-no. You know, it's really hard to keep up. The other resolution that kind of went through below the radar on the daily headlines was the UN General Assembly passed a resolution for the first time saying Palestinians qualify for full member status at the UN. They've been talking around it, but the first time they had a vote and it passed 143-9 with 25 abstentions. And that one of the 9 was the United States, and of course we'll veto it again in the Security Council. Our policy is that a Palestinian state should only emerge through negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. So we'll see. Israelis, even though the United Nations created Israel, have recently felt that they have been discriminated against. And specifically, they mentioned the 1975 vote where the UN declared Zionism was a form of racism. But that was repealed in 1991 as definitions became clearer. So that was premature. But between since 2015, the UN General Assembly has adopted 140 resolutions on Israel. And over that same period, for all the other countries, there's only been 68. So why is this such a hot topic at the United Nations? And I think you'll find Dr. Bali is going to answer that. And for the Palestinians, they're upset that the 48 partition gave Israel a majority of the land. That's 55%, so not a huge majority. But they're still waiting for their state, and maybe after that vote for the first time on May 10th, that'll assuage them a little bit. But they want their self-determination, just like the Palestinians got from the League of Nations. And where's the right of return for the people that have been displaced since 1948? This is what Ms. Bali says. Because America has always been the main rule maker, especially since World War II, we don't quite understand. I'm getting a little lost here. I'm not sure where I am. Yeah. We think of what goes on in the United Nations as a la carte, what is in our interest, as do all the great powers. And that's why we can use the veto. We have that power. Russia certainly has done it with Syria. And under the influence of Saudi Arabia, we have used our veto in Yemen. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of talk now about the Abraham Accords taking the next step, which we were talking about last September, that looked like Saudi Arabia was going to recognize Israel, and the United States was going to pay him off with a huge defense pact. And then that's been tabled. But it sure looks like it's back under discussion. I think Mohammed bin Salman, I think he wants a deal before Trump gets in. Maybe Trump would go ahead. He started the Abraham Accords, but nobody sees him as a consistent player. So it looks like, and he's got the power, he's consolidated the power in Saudi Arabia. If he wants it, it'll go. So what else? Eritrea, Ethiopia haven't really been effective. Yemen, they're all clustered here in the Red Sea. And of course, the Houthis are lobbing ships, grenades, mortars at ships through here. And then the Great Lakes region, I was scratching my head. The Great Lakes, I don't know where this is considered the Great Lakes region, and for some reason, Switzerland is a prominent player here. So this was a rabbit hole I went down, but I'm curious why that is.
Let's start with Albert Schweitzer.
Oh, maybe, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. That would explain it. So the main goal in post-World War II wasn't to prevent all wars like we're seeing now. It was to prevent the big one, the nuclear war. And so we get a Security Council, and you get asymmetric power to the victors. And the representation on the Security Council now doesn't approximate population nor gross national product. look at India, look at Germany. But the big priority was not justice, but let's just not blow each other up. And so now you have so many conflicts bubbling up all around geopolitical zones that there's a risk of one of those metastasizing into a globalized conflict. And we talked about the atrocity in Mumbai, and we talked last week, and we talked about India's strategy of strategic restraint, where they, knowing what was at risk with Pakistan, they did what you're going to see later on. Dr. Bali offer that Israel should have done, strategic restraint. Just forge ahead here. So the international law now gives us a shared vocabulary. If only that's worth a lot. And it elevates possibilities into strategies. And international, just the words have some claim on the powerful. And we're seeing that at this moment. And so the weaker party, which is certainly the Palestinians in Gaza, are having and using a international vocabulary to state their claim. I said the partition initially gave Israel 55%, and that was way too much for the Arabs who'd already had recognition since the League of Nations. Why do these newcomers get 55%? So they launched a war, and then lo and behold, Israel had 78% after that war. And after the Six-Day War, we've seen the maps, how absurd it is. But this was the Israeli flag being raised over Lake Success in New York. I didn't know there was such a lake in 1949. The UN did not send peacekeepers to enforce its own partition. It didn't have any. As opposed to the League of Nations, they set up mandates, and British said, we'll accept the mandate, and they went in with their army. I think the French accepted a mandate for Syria and Lebanon. But there was no troops behind this. It was up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to fight it out among themselves, and they're still doing it. So it's been really an unmanageable situation. The Palestinians argue that there is a Western bias all along. The British, after all, had the Balfour Doctrine. Jewish interests had supported them in World War I, and they declared the Balfour Doctrine, saying that the Jews were entitled to a homeland, not a state, but a homeland. But the Palestinians said that under British mandate, they enabled a pattern of immigration and demographic change that was pro-Western, that was bringing in people that would be able to represent the interests of the West. And I just a time out for a brief personal anecdote, but when Aiko and I were traveling around the world, we had spent a month in Iran, and we're coming out of 6 months in Asia. And when we walked out onto the streets of Tel Aviv, we looked at each other and we said, we're home. There was that feel that we had no other place in Asia until we got to Tel Aviv. So I'm personalizing this complaint by the Palestinians that the pattern of immigration and demographic change was had a Western bias. Okay. So Israel says, how's come there's been 140 resolutions on Israel, but only 68 resolutions on all the other countries combined? Obviously, they feel picked on. So Dr. Bali said, Israel is the only territory that has been slated to be decolonized at the creation of the United Nations. And
is that true?
That's what she made.
She can say it, but is it true? Think of all the other colonies that were in the world in 1948.
It's the only one that was decolonized by the United Nations. That's
a weird point.
Well,
okay, sorry.
Yeah, no. I welcome the interruption. It sharpens my thinking.
But that's the only one that was done by UN resolution. The other decolonizations occurred through the UN recommending decolonization or whatever, but they didn't actually vote on a resolution in the same way as maybe what she's saying.
Yeah, it was more.
I mean, that's a lawyerly point to me. I mean, what is the big point she's trying to make? That somehow Israel is an exception, and that's why they got all the resolutions against them? I mean,
it's why the United Nations takes a particular interest in Israel. All the other colonies were let go by political agreement and often wars of liberation. But the United Nations maybe is that point's being made because we did this. We have some responsibility. Maybe that's it.
Okay, I understand the argument, but to me it sounds really tenuous.
Yeah, John, I want to back up a little. You said that the Jews were relative newcomers to the area. That's not historically accurate. The Jews had been in that area and had a much larger territory for thousands of years and had been kicked out numerous times around, when Christianity started, and then during the Holy Roman Crusade. So they weren't newcomers. They had been dispossessed of their land. We had, as Jew, we had been dispossessed of our land multiple times. And
a better way of saying that would have been the political project with Herzl and Zionism. That was the most recent iteration. And that was recent, but of course you're right. It goes back to the Philistines and the Canaanites versus the people of Judea, and you can't go back any further than that. So your point's well taken. Okay. So the but the rest of the world became decolonized, and we moved forward to the 1990s, and there was the hope that the two troublesome points in the world, which at that time was South Africa with apartheid, and Israel with a long-standing occupation, where the Palestinians had been living with we can say unequal rights, I think, and what's going to happen? And there was hope, and the in South Africa, you had somebody like Nelson Mandela, which don't you wish the Palestinians had someone like that? And that there was international pressure, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that got resolved. There was hope in the Oslo peace process. So we did a unit, I'm going to say 7 or 8 months ago, I think before October 7th, where Fareed Zakaria had an Israeli historian and a Palestinian historian, and we went through this whole thing. If anybody wants the link, I could run it down. You could listen to it, but they went through it step by step, and I just remember at the time how hopeful the Oslo process, and it had been slow a burning, but how hopeful everybody was at a particular point. And then Yitzhak Rabin gets assassinated by a settler. And then you get the massacre at the tomb of Abraham and Sarah by a settler dressed in an IDF uniform. And Hamas reacts, and now terrorism is off full tilt. And it was enormously sad to hear them go through that chronology. There's 143 countries that say the Palestinians are entitled to self-determination as a state. There are 50 countries that don't recognize Palestine. And Ms. Bali makes the point that 50 of those are former colonial powers. So there's an overlap. The disproportionate attention, the global South, as former colonial victims, if you will, they have longstanding grievances, and the question is, the retort is, how did America get away with using violence to found a country? Because if you look at what happened in this country, it's not dissimilar to what may be happening and have happened, and what some people want to continue happen in the Levant. And the point that she makes is, well, first of all, there's nothing to celebrate about our origin story. But the second is that this all happened in Israel under international law. And that's the difference. You can, and we've heard people say, well, the right of conquest, but in 1948, there was no right of conquest. Aggression was aggression, and
so John, who was aggressing at that point?
wait, let me just finish. Any conquered land had to be given back. I'm going to let Jim goes first. He's
got his hand up.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the origin story of the United States. But I would add that Puerto Rico has not been given back, and it was taken by force. Yeah.
And Jim's aunt was a noble.
She actually testified before the UN Commission on Decolonization.
Nice.
In support of freedom for Puerto Rico.
Okay, Harold.
Okay, are you endorsing what this Turkish legal scholar is saying? Or are you disagreeing with her, or are you just presenting it?
I'm presenting it for further discussion, like we're having.
Okay, well, I think it's total BS. I mean, she's taken something that happened 250 years ago as if it was modern day, and calling us a bunch of revolutionaries, which we were at the time. But
what she's saying is that modern people shouldn't take dated events, that we're living in a new world with new standards, which really began at the end of the Second World War. And they continue to evolve. There was no method of implementation, the grand goals that were initiated at the end of World War II, the international ideas of human rights, and there was no way of enforcing it until 2002, when the United Nations set up the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, which is between nations, not directed at indicting individuals like we're seeing now. There is a case, of course, between nations in the International Court of Justice, and South Africa has charged Israel with genocide. And there was a preliminary hearing, and they said that your case is not proven, but we see some disturbing signs. So Israel, could you make sure that aid gets into Gaza? Kind of a slap on the wrist. So as of 2002, there were international mechanisms to enforce the high-minded ideals that were enunciated in 1948. And then in 2005, we talked about the responsibility to protect, where not only can you get involved in genocide next door, you must. And that's surely has been challenged, successfully, and we're still living in a world where these new standards are not being enforced, but they're there. And I think at the very beginning of the discussion, the comment was made that it's easy to get discouraged because these highfalutin laws are being ignored. But it's important that they're there. And we've gone over 4 or 5 reasons why just being there, even if you fail, can be useful. So I've already made that point. Secondly, there were new rules also at the end of the Second World War about the conduct of war and the protection of refugees. And it's in this backdrop that Israel came into existence. And the problem that we have now is 14 million people sharing this territory, half of whom have exercised the right of self-determination, which is deemed, even at the League of Nations, was deemed to be a right, and that the Palestinians were given. And obviously that's been, and from the Palestinian point of view, it's the 6-Day War. They lost more territory, and ideally under rules of law, you'd negotiate a satisfactory end with the return of territory, but that for many reasons hasn't been the case. But each encounter, Israel gets stronger and stronger, and controls more and more territory.
I have a question, John.
Yeah.
So in wars, as far as the UN is concerned, and you're talking about equalization of responsibility after a war, is there a provision in international law for who is the aggressor?
Exactly.
Yeah. So how's that handled in international law?
So in international law, the greatest crime in the International Criminal Court is the crime of aggression. And do you remember when we were talking about Khan, and now that he's indicted both sides in Gaza, that still another shoe to drop in Ukraine would be to accuse Putin not just of war crimes because of what his troops are doing, but of Putin itself at the very first act, the initiation of the aggression. And that's still a possibility.
Thank you.
I didn't think the point had to do with the current situation in Israel, Gaza, but with the implications of the words on this slide. The Arab world was the aggressor in many of these wars that enabled Israel to retain a far larger swath. Just the way that's worded is very peculiar to me. All subsequent plans have enabled Israel to retain far larger swaths acquired by use of force. It was use of force in response to invasion, to aggression. And then the gain in territory was part of the settlement of the war, the treaty.
And I would assume that if the International Criminal Court would ever prosecute aggression, that would be part of it. But and certainly the settlement would have to recognize that the new borders with more secure protections against future aggression would have to be part of the settlement. But I take
that was in the
your
case.
point.
Yeah, and that was in the case of 1967 that the Israelis argued that they couldn't defend themselves if the surrounding states had the hills between them and
Right.
the state over, etc.
Yeah. So she's also quite clear that Hamas, even though it's not clearly a state, that it violated the laws of war by doing what we all thought was horrible. And so that's why they're being indicted also. She was asked, well, what could Israel have done? I alluded to this earlier. How could they have shown a strategic restraint? And she said, well, police action in Gaza, focused, targeted, investigation of what went wrong with the individuals captured in Israel, and that Israel clearly would have jurisdiction in that. So would that have been enough? No, obviously, but they could obviously target facilities that made it possible for crossings. But they need there was obviously, and I think everybody agrees, the Netanyahu regime made a lot of mistakes. And this is a key slide, and I hope I'm winding down here. But the key word is disproportionate. Disproportionate, that what Israel is, and you can understand how it happened and how terrible things were. But in terms of 8 months on now, and looking at it, putting on the brakes and seeing if international law applies, is disproportionate. This is probably controversial too. Ms. Bali says Hamas does not represent an existential threat to Israel. Well, I think we'd all say the cumulative effect of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis do. The Israeli government has to use the principles of proportionality as it prioritizes the military necessity. You've got to be able to protect civilians. And what can you target within Hamas? It's kind of hard to do a global attack to wipe out Hamas, because it's also the governing authority in charge of all the civil service, municipal services, the hospital systems. You can't destroy the whole governing authority according to her interpretation of international law. So just to bring it home to us, we didn't think of any of this. We just went after those who needed to be gotten, and we just kept going. And she said, "You did," but I think some people regret it. That it was not just a disaster for the people in Afghanistan, but it was also a disaster for the United States itself. And she suggests there could have been strategic restraint on our part as well. So I'm winding down here.
I have a question for you, John, in the chat.
Okay, I'll just, I think this is an important point. The the people in the global South, how are they looking at this? And they're not necessarily looking at just the atrocity. They're also looking at Hamas as a movement for national liberation, which she suggests was sort of our Minutemen were a movement for national liberation. And there is a right to armed resistance in the international legal order. There have been additional protocols added to the Geneva Conventions that allow for armed resistance. That's clearly in the cause of national liberation, not terror. So I think this is probably where time is stopping me. I have a few more slides, but I'm going to stop here and catch my breath because I'm sure there's other things to say.
John, I'm confused still about the fact that the Palestinians have been under lockdown for years and years and years. And so no wonder there's no future from their perspective. So regardless of whether it's Hamas is picking up the slack or whatever's happening, it's one thing to have all of the legal things on your side, but I don't understand it. I mean, the Palestinians essentially are in a situation of no hope.
Yeah, and there's there's a lot of them. Half the population, and that was the point. The last couple of slides. It's a struggle for national liberation. And you can understand that. But the problem that makes it so hard is the terrorism and the terrible effects of that. But unfortunately, terrorists succeed. I think their goal was to stop the Abraham Accords, and they did. Yeah, Harold.
Yeah, I mean, you feel sorry for the Palestinians individually, but as a group that allowed Hamas to come to power, and basically there was one election where they were the plurality, but not the majority, got them into office, and it's kind of like a communist election. Once you get in, you stay in, and they could have done something other than being lobbing rockets and digging tunnels to make a better life for themselves, but that was Hamas's call. That's what they want to do, is lob rockets and dig tunnels.
Yeah, and I remember
until Hamas gets out of there, I don't see a solution.
Yeah, I remember when
If I were an Israeli, I would run them all into Egypt. The Egyptians are doing their best to keep them out, which is causing part of the problem.
Yeah, Irene.
I would agree that the Palestinians are in a without hope position. And to me, the worst part is that it seems that the Arab states are very interested in keeping the Palestinians in a wounded position because they haven't up till the Abraham Accords have not been interested in having Israel there. And so they wanted to they don't support the Palestinians. And so the fact that they're driven to terroristic methods, I have sympathy for that. I have no idea about a solution, but it's horrific, the position that the Palestinians are in. And there was a quote recently that as far as Israelis are concerned, the fact that there are more Palestinians than Israelis in the area, that to have an equality of the two populations means that the Israelis would be pretty much wiped out, that they either have a Jewish state or they have no state. So to me, it's just a quagmire. And
Yeah,
I appreciate your efforts, John, very much in presenting this relatively controversial analysis. I appreciate it enormously.
well, I've been really engaged with this ever since that Fareed Zakaria one on the demise of the Oslo Accords. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I had my question over there in the chat box. But basically, I says, does it say anything that in the last two instances, we, the United States and other entities, have had to deal with organizations where we hardly know who is their leader or spokesperson? The first is the Taliban, the second Hamas. These shadowy individuals and organizations exist in a nebulous world where names, faces, and credentials are unknown. They're just characterized as terrorists. I mean, you said they had a search to find one picture of this guy who's supposedly the leader of Hamas. This kind of, we don't know who we're dealing with even. Who's their spokesperson?
Well, Sinwar won power in 2017, and everybody knows who he is. The second guy, what did they call him? The guest. He hasn't really been seen in public. Now, Mossad has tried to assassinate him 7 times, and so they kind of know where he is. But Sinwar is, they think, on the border there with Egypt somewhere, and he's the one that's negotiating with Qatar. So Qatar seems to have a line through to him, and Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan seem to know what he'd accept and what he wouldn't accept in the way of ceasefire. So I don't know how they know, but they're in contact with Sinwar.
Well, okay. My point is that for the most part, we hardly know who to negotiate with. I mean, you may pick out one individual, but does he have some way of communicating with the people who are, let's say, holding the hostages, the Israeli hostages, and so on? I mean, all of this is just, the fact is the whole paradigm has changed. We're not dealing with governmental entities as we've known them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, we had that, of course, with Al Qaeda and ISIS, but we knew who they were enough to take them out. So
well, we knew. Like I mentioned the example of the Taliban. To this day, I don't know. I've never heard of who's the leader, who's running Afghanistan.
No, there's a well-defined leader of the Taliban.
Well, okay. I mean, but do they
there has been, always has been.
Do they have a seat in the United Nations?
I think they do. I don't know if who they're recognized by. Not all governments recognize them, but China, I think, recognizes them.
No. All right. Well, it's just a point because we're not, as I say, we're not dealing with governmental entities the way we used to, signing treaties and so on. And if you want to go there, getting a visa, who knows, like who do you apply to? What entity would be responsible for monitoring the safety and health of the population, so on?
Well, they don't do a very good job of it, but they're there.
Ask the CIA.
Yeah.
I just looked it up on Google. It says United Nations since 2021 rejects Taliban's bid for Afghanistan seat in the organization. 3 times. But that's since 2021. We're in 2024, so I don't know what's happened in 3 years.
Well, yeah, be interesting, but my guess is that Afghanistan may not have anybody representing them in the UN.
You may be right.
So, but that's going to increasingly become the way that we are going to start dealing with a lot of these other countries. I mean, they're going to, if they have uprisings and so on, we won't know who is in charge.
Yeah.
Anyway, good talk.
All right. Thank you. It was a very depressing talk.
It's a depressing subject.
So we'll get back to happier times with Junipero, Sarah.
I
Yeah.
want to ask one question as we leave, which is, I'm really curious, given the amount of attention to pro-Palestinian uprisings, in quotes, on campuses and the challenge that presents to votes for Biden. I want to know how much of the let's get this settled energy before the election has to do with that.
I'm sure. Yeah. A lot.
Yes. If that can do it, more power to them.
But do you think Hamas would be holding out with the idea that Trump might come into power? I mean,
I
Trump
have
would
no
be.
idea. I was
I
just
mean,
thinking about from the Biden perspective.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the pro, I don't know, the people who are for Israel would want Trump because he's embraced them one authoritarian to another.
Lord knows what Trump wants. He says really awful stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I don't trust him.
Well, this election's not unlike 1968 when we were all around, and Richard Nixon, I think he had Kissinger try to put a brake on a possible breakthrough in the negotiations with.
Absolutely, he did.
Yeah, he did.
To weaken Hubert Humphrey. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
So the point about Trump and what that he might finagle something. Do you think who's worse, Trump or Richard Nixon?
Oh,
Trump.
Trump.
You
Yeah.
know what? That's like having a bunch of rotten potatoes and saying, which one do you want to eat?
But yeah, you look what Nixon bought onto later on. He was a great ecology.
DNRA, yes.
Yeah. So go figure.
Yeah. Well, anyway. Thank you, John.
Yeah, good deal.
Oh,
Thank
Jim,
you. This is really interesting.
Jim's got his hand up.
Oh,
Yeah,
Jim.
according to Google, it says no country recognizes the Taliban. It is Afghanistan's government. And the UN has said that recognition is almost impossible while bans on female education and employment remain in place.
Good.
Good
Good.
for them.
From
The UN.
February 2024
Thank you, Jen.
So
There
they're
you
not-
go. The UN doing something right.
Unless you're
Go
the
figure.
It's our only hope. Don't knock it down.
Yeah.
Thanks again, John.
And the ICC.
Okay,
All right.
see you
Good
next
night,
week.
everybody.
Hi.
All right. Bye-bye.
They needed to listen to my aunt,
Uh,
the UN.